Thank you very much for that nice introduction. So I'm going to talk about some of the research that we've got going on in my group in Glasgow. So I'm from computing science, and my research area is human-computer interaction, which I'll tell you something about what that is. Okay.
We'll go back on what the yes.
Right. Okay. Technical problem resolved. So, human-computer interaction, that's my research area. This is what the definition of that is. It's a discipline concerned with design, evaluation, and implementation of interactive computing systems. So I'm really a software guy, but I like to use novel, interesting sensors, maybe that you guys are the experts in. We don't develop a lot of hardware ourselves because we're mostly software, but we try to do interesting things with it to enable our end users to do new kinds of things. So my particular focus is around what's called multimodal interaction. Maybe as Anakashi mentioned just in the intro, we're really interested in how we use all the capabilities that humans have. Right now, most of what I do is stabbing with my fingers on some keys and looking at a screen. But actually, as a human being, I have a lot more things I can do. I have multiple senses, lots of different ways of controlling things, doing gestures, speaking. So my research is all about kind of understanding what these human capabilities are and then designing new kinds of interactions that take advantage of them. So that's mostly a link between computer science and psychology, but it does link strongly to, for example, novel sensors and novel actuators that we might use to enable these new things. So the thing I'm going to talk about today is haptics. So this is all about our sense of touch. This is how we experience the world by feeling textures, by pushing and moving things around. Very rich human sense. But most of the time when we're using our devices, you might be touching on a touch screen, but what does that feel like? Feel like anything. It's completely smooth. Or typing on a keyboard, I'm not really using the same skills that I might be if I was feeling the subtle differences in the materials, things like that. So we have a rich human capability here. How can we use it for interaction? Now, you're all familiar with haptics in some form because if you have your mobile phone, it buzzes when you get a message, or you might feel it as you type in keys on the touchscreen keyboard. So you get something from that vibration. That's useful. But there's a whole lot more that the human sense of touch is capable of. And that's what we're interested in within the area of haptics. So things I do in general, yes, a lot of haptics we'll talk about today. Also do a lot of augmented reality, virtual reality, and also around cyber and motion sickness, which come up for virtual reality. We do a lot of work in autonomous vehicles, both inside the vehicle and outside the vehicle. Things with audio, things with health and accessibility, things with robots. But in all of these cases, it's thinking about how does the human interact with these kind of things. A little bit of history about me. We started off doing lots of work in haptics around multi-point haptics on your hand, trying to communicate different things that you might get on your phone. This one was looking at using pressure inputs, so force input. So, your hands are very flexible, can do very rich kind of input. So how could you do that whilst holding a device? This is a bimanual interaction. So using a device with two hands and looking at how you can use both of the hands. Your hands aren't the same. They have different roles in interactions. So how can we use the different capabilities of the different hands for interaction? This is a nice picture of a care robot. So we were looking at how you could augment the features of care robots with new sensors, new types of feedback, for example, warming feedback and vibration feedback. We're also looking at electrotactile stimulation, so replacing the vibration motor with something which directly stimulates the skin. There you have interesting issues about sensing around impedance, for example. But the thing to talk about today, we're going to talk about ultrasound. So you might say, well, what's ultrasound got to do with interaction? That's for medical purposes or other types of things. But actually, there's some interesting new things you can do with ultrasound for interacting with people. So we'll go back to high school physics for a moment. So what we're thinking of here is phased array ultrasound. So we can control the timing very precisely. And if you remember back to your school physics, if you have two point sources emitting waves. Some points they cause interference patterns, and they cause stronger pressure and weaker pressure. And if you do this carefully, then you can create feelable forces above a surface. So with an array of actuators, I can put my hand above that, and then I can feel the forces against my hand. And that's quite interesting because it's a non-contact form of haptics. So every other haptic device, like if it's my phone, which is over there, imagine this is a phone, I'd have to be holding it to feel the vibration. For every other type of haptics, you have to be in physical contact. But with this one, I can beam the haptics to my hands wherever they are. So it gives you some interesting opportunities because your hands aren't occupied holding something. How do you do it? Well, these are the actuators that you have. For example, if you have a car, these might be in the bumpers of the car to stop you reversing into something behind you. So these emit ultrasound, 44 kilohertz sound, which can then be detected in the car and give you feedback about whether you're about to crash into something. So the hardware conceptually is very simple. It's just using arrays of these small high-frequency loudspeakers. The clever part comes in the timing of the control of all of those to create the interference patterns that you need. If you do that, then you can do interesting things like creating these patterns. Now, it's very difficult to show haptics because it's invisible. So this is the attempt to show it. You can see these pieces of paper at the bottom there. It's a little bit hard to see, but that's that array of actuators. You can see that we can precisely control different focal points on that array to generate some force. In this case, it's lifting up these pieces of paper. If your hand was there, you'd feel that vibration against your hand. You can see that in a different way. This is the sound waves imaged using Schlieren imaging. So you can see on the left-hand side is where the array is. The sound wave is moving towards the right. You can see if you put something into the scene there, the sound waves bounce off it. And if it bounces off, that's where you'd feel it on your hand. You can see a hand in a minute. So when your hand is in there, then you can feel that force against your hand. So it's designing the sound wave to generate the kind of feedback. That's the interesting thing here. So there's ultrasound loudspeakers. They're operating to around 40 kilohertz. You cannot feel 40 kilohertz on your skin. You can only perceive up to a few thousand hertz. So what we do is we modulate that down to about 250 hertz, which is in the frequency range that the mechanoreceptors in your skin can perceive. And from that, then we can do interesting things like create textures, roughness, different kinds of experiences through this mechanism. As you would always do, we started off with amplitude modulation, just turning the thing on and off and on and off to do this modulation, to get it down to 250 kilohertz. But actually, that ends up with quite a weak force because your actuators aren't running at full power all the time. So now what we do is what we call spatiotemporal modulation, is where you run the actuators at 100% power, but just move the focal point slightly. So by moving it slightly, it creates a stronger sensation on the skin, and you can run the actuators at full power. So if you wanted to create a shape on your hand, you can just draw a circle very rapidly, moving the focal point around, because we have quite precise control over that. So from the early work, yes, rendering has a really big impact on perception. The strength of these cues here are not that strong because you're only moving air against your hand. So you need to run the actuators as much as possible to generate the strongest force you can. So what we do mostly in my work is we start off with some basic perceptual studies. How do people understand and experience this stimulus? And then use that for design. So here, top right, you can see an early experiment where we were using an array above the hand like that to understand perception. So how do people perceive this kind of feedback? We looked at amplitude modulation, we looked at spatiotemporal modulation, we looked at localization. So, how precisely can you identify the position of this on your hand? We also looked at apparent motion. If we want to draw shapes on your hand, we need to understand how that works, what speed you should move the points, things like that. So for localization, people were able to identify the location on the hand with about 8.5 millimeter accuracy. Pretty good, about centimeter kind of accuracy. The y-axis was a little bit worse than the x-axis, and nearer the center was better because you have a distribution of mechanoreceptors under your skin, which is different across the hand. But in the central part, you have quite good resolution, which is good, for example, for holding objects so that you don't drop them, as we heard from yesterday's robot talk. And we were able to create this idea of apparent motion to draw shapes on the hand. People could reliably detect shapes that we drew on the hand. So now we know that we can do something useful with it and how people perceive it. Then the next stage was to use it for some applications. One place we started was thinking about games. So here you might have an actuator on the table in front of you. You can have your hands above it, and then you can start interacting. Here's a. Can we make that play? Here we go. So this is a game we made. So it's a kind of tom-tom drumming game. Now, typically, if you were doing this with your bare hand, you wouldn't get any feedback. Or if you were using controllers to do this, then you're not using your bare hands. But with this case, we can do feedback to the hands that are moving. So you're doing you're tapping as the blocks come by. We can beam that haptic feedback to your hand. So you can feel that every time you tap on one of these targets. That really improves your experience of the game. A drumming game without feeling the drums, it doesn't even make sense. So in this case, we can create a much richer kind of interaction, but your hands aren't occupied. So you can do more realistic drumming gestures, but feel the feedback on your hands. Another thing that we then thought about was, well, maybe I can create some virtual controls. So perhaps I want some kind of interaction elements, but I don't need them all the time, but I want them when I need them. So for example, I could pop up some control when I need it, and it can go away when I don't need it. Here's an example of that. So maybe by the side of my desktop, I've got an array, and I need a slider at some point for controlling an application. I can pop up a slider, I can feel the slider and move the slider, then the slider goes away when I don't need it anymore. I can pop up something else when I need that. So it gives you a way to create controls as you need them. You can feel them and interact with them. We apply this also to car dashboards. So the nice thing about doing this in a car dashboard means that I don't need to look to where the controls are. I can just beam the controls to my hand. So for example, we had an array above the gear stick, so I could be driving and then feel some controls above my hand, operate the controls, but still keep my eyes on the road. We also did a version for a mobile phone. So we had an array next to a phone. So then you can interact above your phone, but get haptic feedback. Some phones now allow you to do an interaction above the phone using the front-facing camera, but there's no feedback. With this, we can give you feedback to the hand by projecting the tactile feedback to your hand from beside the phone. In this case, it was a kind of fold-out display that folded out of the phone cover and then went inside the phone. So it gives you a way of getting this extra feedback when you're not touching a device. So that's the unique thing about this ultrasound. It doesn't require you to be holding something. It means you can do whatever you want with your hands. You're not limited to having to hold a device like you would be with every other type of haptics. So, can create forces in the air in a non-contact way. It's well perceived by users, but the forces are not that strong. In the end, it's only air that's moving against your hands. It's not like pushing against a solid surface. So it has some limitations, but is useful for some things. We can create interesting interactions without physical contact. So one of the partners on the project I'll talk about next, they had some really nice demonstrations. So they had some movie posters, big movie posters. When you touch the movie poster, it doesn't really make sense. You look at the movie poster. One of the movie posters was about Star Wars. And as you walked up to it, you could feel the force because it would be beamed to your hands. And, you know, the kids thought that was amazing. You know, they were becoming Jedi because they could feel the force. There was another one with Harry Potter. So then you could walk up to the movie poster, and then you could kind of feel the spell against your hand. So it gives you this kind of interaction for things like in situations where you can't easily touch something. And in those two examples were really nice. There is something there. There is the force, and we'd all like to be able to experience the force. And so we could beam that to your hand from something beside the movie poster. So it's got some very interesting interaction possibilities. But I think something more interesting that you can do with it is levitation. So we had a project which involved various partners from around Europe, looking at how you might use this ultrasound for something in addition to just the haptics. So this was the kind of sales pitch that we made. So we're creating this radically new human-computer interaction paradigm that allows the unadorned user to reach into a new kind of display composed of levitating matter. Wow, sounds amazing. So what were we doing here? Well, we were using the same phased array ultrasound as before, but this time, instead of using the feeling the forces against your hand, we use those forces to support small objects in midair. So these objects were 2mm polystyrene beads, kind of packaging material. And these were used like physical pixels. So instead of the pixels you might have on your display, these were physical things supported in the air. So you're creating a display of these physical elements supported in the air to build up a kind of complex 3D model in space. So it's a kind of totally different way of rendering an object. Rather than rendering it on a screen or using a VR headset where you're kind of faking a 3D thing, you're actually generating a real 3D thing sitting in front of you. Here's an example. So this is the array. You can see this time we've got an array on the top and the bottom. You can do it one-sided, but top and the bottom gives you stronger forces. Now, these are the polystyrene beads just held in place there. And you can see, you know, they're not held up by string or wire because we can move these tweezers around. So each one of those is a kind of 2mm polystyrene bead held up in the air, pretty stable. So this is a kind of visualization of what we're doing, or one way of controlling the sound, this kind of sound space. It's all about designing the sound field, really. So in this case, with one on top and one on the bottom, we can create a set of standing waves. Then what you do is you create an acoustic trap, which is basically you put a polystyrene bead between two areas of high pressure. It kind of clamps it in space, and then you can move it around. So you sit it in an area of low pressure between two areas of high pressure, and you can move it around. As you saw in the previous one, here's another example. So here we've got an array on the top and bottom. It's a slightly larger space this time. So we've marked out the four corners of a cube, so you can rotate that cube around in space. Really stable. Movement is pretty smooth. It's quite strange when you look at it because the thing is just sitting there in space, held up. I'll play it again. Held up, you know, with no obvious mechanism, and it just sits there, very stable. So that means then you could imagine we could render that with more pixels to create more interesting shapes. You know, you could render the shape of some other kind of object if you wanted to, and then you can move it around. So we have very precise control over the sound field by controlling the timing and the amplitude of each of those speakers. You have to do that very quickly, and there's a lot of computation that goes on in the background. So here's another example. So this time we're rotating in a different plane. Sorry about the wobbly camera work. So this one, you can see the beads are a little bit wobblier. So it's much easier to rotate something. The standing waves, of course, are going vertically. It's easy to rotate this way because you don't have to move between one standing wave to the next. You just rotate the whole space. In this case, we have to move between the waves, which is much more difficult to do. If you're not careful, the beads just fly out and you lose them. So it's all about controlling very precisely where these acoustic traps are. So it's very difficult. We were super happy when we managed to get this kind of rotation because that's very difficult to do. But we can control these individual pixels very precisely. In the same way as you can control an individual pixel on your visual display precisely, we can control a pixel very precisely here. Let's go to the next one. Of course, I'm a human-computer interaction person, so I don't want just a display. I also want to be able to interact with it. And we'll come back to more of this in a minute, but here's just an example. So here, if you can see the black bar just in front of you and there, that's a leap motion sensor. So that's an optical tracker using IR cameras. And here we can use this to control the objects in the display. So he can move his hands around. When he sticks his thumb out, he starts controlling the display and can move the pixels around. So we have precise control of the movements of the pixels from his hands. And then I'm not sure what this one's for, but it's kind of fun. So also we can have other things in the display. The problem here is if you put things in the display, it reflects the sound in different directions and makes it unstable. So this one, these objects are acoustically transparent. So the mesh and the felt are acoustically transparent, and therefore we can control the movement of the pixel without them affecting the sound field. So our idea was this is the game where you have to move the metal hoop along the wire without touching, otherwise the buzzer goes off, kind of fairground kind of thing. So you can do the same idea with this. So it means you can have other objects in the sound field. It's difficult to put your hand in the sound field because you put the big fleshy thing in there and the sound bounces off in quite unpredictable ways. But having acoustically transparent things there works just fine. So applications for this. Well, our idea was then you might have dynamic 3D physical display. So I can levitate, if I levitate with a lot of pixels, I can create an object as I need it in front of me. When I don't need it, it disappears. I can create a new object when I need that. And I can control the appearance of that. Now you could do that with 3D printing, but it's very much slower. So I can print an object a few hours later, damn it, it was not quite the right shape. Or I could do it with a VR headset, but then it's always tricking your eyes into 3D. Whereas it's 3D. It really is a 3D thing. So it's good for a shared data visualization, for example. I can create an object. We can all look at it because it's sitting there in physical space. So it gives a new way to kind of understand data and information because we can rapidly create something and change it, and then it can disappear if we don't need it anymore. But a thing that we were thinking a lot about in this project is interactivity. So yes, it's okay to create an object, but I actually want to be able to manipulate the object as well. So how do we interact with them? We can't touch them because these are just polystyrene beads. If you touch it, it's just going to fly off because it weighs nothing and your big fat finger will push it out of the way. But selection is fundamental for interaction. I can't interact unless I can say, that's the thing that I want. The other interesting problem, at least in this simple display, is that the only visible elements are these objects. For a pixel on my screen here, I can change it to be any color that I like, or RGB. I can change it to be any color that I like for a set of pixels. We've only got one pixel, so yes, you can project on them, which we did do, but in the simplest case, all I've got is the pixels. So I've got to do something with those pixels to indicate selection. So this is one attempt. So here we've got two pixels side by side, and what I need to do is select one of them. So what we do is we cast a ray from your finger. If it hits a pixel, we start jiggling the pixel around. Or we move this pixel around. So we use a small movement of the pixel to indicate it's the one that's the target of attention. You can see it shaking around as it points towards it. Now, those pixels are 2 millimeters. You want the pixels to be small, smaller pixels, higher resolution. Except that humans are not at all very good at selecting things of 2 millimeter size from a distance away. We're just not accurate enough. So what you have to do is put some kind of zone around the pixel to make it more selectable. If it's too small, you just can't point at it. Of course, the more selection space you put around it, the lower resolution your display. So you kind of have a trade-off between resolution and interactability. So this is just a simple graph of the time it took to select something. So you can see for a 5 millimeter pixel, it takes a long time to precisely select the thing you want. Whereas as soon as you get to about 20 to 30, it starts to get a bit more feasible. So you can levitate these things, but there are human constraints that you have to deal with. This is a system which is designed for humans. Now, maybe you just want an object, you don't need to interact with it, in which case this is not an issue for you. But if you need to be able to select pixels, you need to have some space around them to make them selectable. Then the next problem occurs is that, well, this is a 3D object. How do I select a pixel which isn't on the front? A pixel at the back, or a pixel that's inside the object? So you have occlusions. So as you can see from here, maybe I want to select that second pixel. Well, how do I do that? Well, we use this technique called lock ray. So you you fire a ray that selects a set of pixels on that line from the front to the back of the object. You stick out your thumb, which locks those pixels, and then you move in and out, and that chooses which pixel you want along that line. I'll show you a video of it to make sense. So I select a line of pixels, all of them start jiggling to show I've chosen that set. Lock the target ray. And then I move in and out to select the one I want. That works pretty well. So we did a study to investigate performance in this using this kind of technique. We used targets of about 20 millimeters. So that's a 20 millimeter diameter around each pixel to make them more selectable. So people were able to select relatively quickly, but with high accuracy. So this works as a selection technique. Of course, it depends on how many pixels you want to select along that line, but works well as a selection technique. Okay, so we can levitate them. We can select individual pixels. The next problem is obstacles. In your virtual pixel, your visual pixel display, obstacles don't exist. I can move my cursor over a pixel, it just changes color as I move from one to the next. All is good. It doesn't work in this case because there's a physical thing in the way. If I want to move my pixel here to over here, and there's another pixel in the way, well, what happens? It doesn't just disappear, it's physically there. So you have to deal with these obstacles when you're dragging. So what do you do with the particles that's in the way? We looked at a whole range of different techniques. I'll show you some of them in action in a minute. Well, maybe I should just show you the video first, and you can have a look. This one first is the artist's impression of how it should work. Actually, maybe I'll turn the volume of that down. I'll turn the volume of that one off, and then oops, and then wait, back. Yeah, I just want to turn the volume off because it's not going to show so well. Yes. So what we're looking at here is how to move an object. So this is what you saw before. This is the visualization of what the sound space looks like. So if you're not careful, if you move one pixel, the soundscape can merge the two standing waves, and the pixels either fall out or get stuck. So what you need to do is be able to move the things out the way. So different ways you could do that. Here's an example, what should we call shift obstacle. So as you're moving your pixel, the other one just jumps out of the way. Or you could do the same thing and move the pixel that you're controlling out of the way. But you could do a bit of both. Both pixels got to move out of the way. You get the idea. I'll just show you divert obstacle. This one where the obstacle just slowly moves out of the way and comes back again. You get the idea. So this is how to deal with these obstacles that are in the way. Here I could move my pixel out of the way, or you can move the other one out of the way. So that was the kind of artist's impression of how it worked. Doing it in reality is a lot more challenging. You can see how it works actually in practice. So it's a little bit hard to see on the thing there. You get the same idea. It is quite hard to precisely control the movement of those things when you're in a very, we need to control very particular movements. So we can do it, but we're in the early stages of building the control mechanisms to do this. So the divert obstacle particle was the best. So that's the one where I'm moving my pixel. This one slowly moves out of the way and comes behind me. That will work the best out of all the different types. People didn't like it when their own pixel was moved. So if I'm dragging this one and my pixel goes out of the way, people found that confusing because their control movement was the same, but the pixel movement was different. So they much preferred it when the obstacle particle moved out of the way. And this kind of diversion one was the best. There's an obvious problem. Scaling. So in our example with only 2 pixels, the obstacle pixel can go where it likes. Doesn't really matter. But what happens if there's another pixel in the way of where you want to move the obstacle pixel? Well, then that one has to move. So you can see that there's potentially cascading effects of what to do when you move things around in a densely packed array. Now, if you think about it, this is the same as what happens with those nice displays they make with drones. You often see drones at festivals and things where they have 1,000 drones flying with LED lights on them, and they can make shapes in the sky. Well, it's the same problem. You can't move a drone where there's another drone. You have to have some very careful control mechanisms to be able to deal with that. So that's just the same problem at a larger scale than what we have here. For us, the soundscape is of a fixed size. Eventually, a pixel will fall out at the end because there's nowhere for it to go. So no, that's not always a problem, because maybe you're only representing the outer surface of an object, in which case perhaps you've got space. But if your display is very densely packed, then scaling is quite a difficult issue to deal with. And one that there's no clear solution to that yet. We're just starting to understand how to deal with some of these problems. So time for some conclusions. So my research area is all about multimodal human-computer interaction. And this is trying to enable kind of richer interactions between humans and technology, trying to take advantage of all those things that I've got as a human that I would like to use to control my technology, rather than just using my eyes and my fingers to stab at things. Ultrasound is a highly novel modality. Very little work is going on with that right now, but it has got some very interesting properties. So it can provide some very new, interesting, radical ways of interaction. It's the only way of doing non-contact haptics. So sometimes you want your hands to be free. You don't want to be holding controllers or holding a phone. Sometimes you want your hands to be free. And the only way to give haptic feedback in that case is to beam it to your hands. And you can do that. Now, if you have a TV on the wall, I can be watching the TV and then I can be feeling feedback on my hands from the TV without having to touch anything. And that doesn't stop me, picking up my coffee and drinking it. My hands are free. So it gives you some unique capabilities there. Then you can also do levitation of these physical pixels. So by levitating these 2mm pixels, then you can create a representation of a physical object in space. By levitating enough of those, you can create a rich representation. Levitating lots of them isn't particularly difficult. Interacting with lots of them is where the problems start to occur. And people often say, well, could you levitate a human with this? No, it's the wrong technology for that. You can levitate humans with other mechanisms. You can use electromagnetic or something like that. What this gives you is very precise control, millimeter level control, but over a small object. So for representing a model like this in front of me, what I really want is resolution. That's why we've got millions of pixels on our screens. I want high resolution. I don't want low resolution and strong weight. I want low weight and high resolution and interactability. So we get very precise control. Those pixels are very light, so there's little inertia. I can move them around very simply. In some of the studies that we did on the project, we could move the pixels at more than a meter a second. So we can move them very quickly if we need to. So here what we've built is the foundations for interaction. I kind of like to think about this like maybe we're in the 1950s and somebody's drawn a pixel on the screen of their oscilloscope. And they say, wow, look, this is totally amazing. We've drawn a pixel on the screen of our oscilloscope. That's totally groundbreaking. And then 50 years later, we have 1 billion pixels and nobody pays any attention. But at the beginning, drawing those pixels was extremely complicated and managing that was extremely complicated. Now, take it completely as a normal thing. But we're in the situation of being in the 1950s. We can create a few pixels in space, but we haven't yet worked out all of the mechanisms for controlling them. But we've built some of the foundations. So now we've got some of the foundations. Now we can start to build some interesting applications using them. So that's where it kind of opens up to everybody else, to you guys who might use it, to other people, to application developers, because they could start to then use these technologies to build new applications. So that's really my role here, is to build those physical tools that allow you to create the next generation of applications. So hopefully I've given you a few examples of this kind of things that the ultrasound allows you to do. And then we can discuss, if you have any great ideas, how we might do them in the future. All right, thank you very much.